The autumn wind blew gently through the golden maple leaves on the outskirts of Boston in 1918. Eleanor Wright, a young woman of 22 with neatly tied wavy brown hair, stood on the porch of her family's simple wooden house. Her emerald green eyes gazed far down the path leading to the train station. That day, her brother James would depart for Europe to join the First World War, leaving Eleanor with their ailing father. Early in the morning, Eleanor had already risen to prepare a special breakfast for James. Freshly baked whole grain bread with her homemade blueberry jam, scrambled eggs with smoked ham, and a cup of hot coffee whose aroma filled the entire room. James, in his neat soldier's uniform, savored each bite slowly, as if wanting to remember every taste of home that he might not experience again for a very long time. Their father, Ernest Wright, a Civil War veteran, now bedridden with lung disease, could only offer a weak embrace and a few words of advice as James said goodbye. As the train carried James away, Eleanor returned to her daily routine. She worked at the local library, arranging books and helping visitors find the readings they sought. Though her salary wasn't much, Eleanor was grateful because the job gave her access to a vast world of knowledge, something she had always craved since childhood. After work, she would stop by the grocery store to buy fresh ingredients that she would cook into warm soup for her father, then hurry home before sunset. The first weeks after James's departure were very difficult. Letters from the battlefield came late and infrequently, causing Eleanor to spend many nights consumed with worry. She spent her spare time knitting sweaters and warm socks that she would send to Europe, hoping to protect her brother from the cold winter in the trenches. Ernest, though physically weaker, always tried to encourage his daughter with stories about the courage and resilience of the Wright family throughout previous generations. One day in October, when the leaves had turned into a carpet of red and gold along the streets, Eleanor received a telegram that changed her life. James had been reported missing in action in a small village in France. There was no further information, no certainty whether he was still alive or had fallen. The news shattered Eleanor's heart, but she tried hard to hide her sadness from her father, whose condition was worsening. Every night, Eleanor cried silently in her room, hugging James' photo, while whispering hopes that a miracle would bring her brother home. That winter was the worst Eleanor had ever experienced. Snow fell earlier and heavier than usual, turning Boston streets into a freezing white sea. Ernest's condition deteriorated, his cough worsened, and his body grew thinner. Eleanor was forced to take an additional job as a seamstress in a clothing store to buy medications and nutritious food for her father. Her once soft hands became rough and covered with wounds from needles constantly pricking her skin, but Eleanor never complained. In the midst of life's hardships, Eleanor still found beauty in small things. She loved the moments when she read books to her father by the fireplace, when the old man's eyes sparkled listening to adventures he could never experience again. She enjoyed the moments when the snow stopped falling and the sun emerged, creating a diamond-like glitter on the untouched white surface. And she appreciated the kindness of her neighbors, who sometimes knocked on the door to deliver a warm pie or simply to ask how they were doing. As Christmas approached, the entire town was decorated with beautiful ornaments and twinkling lights. But the Wright family home remained simple without decorations. Eleanor had no money to buy a Christmas tree or gifts, but she still tried to create a warm atmosphere by baking her father's favorite gingerbread cookies and lighting pine-scented candles. On Christmas Eve, after her father had fallen asleep, Eleanor sat on the front porch, gazing at the stars twinkling in the black sky, and whispered hopes that wherever James was, he could feel the warmth and love from home. Early 1919 brought joyful news to the world. World War I had ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. American soldiers began returning to their homeland, welcomed with parades and celebrations across the nation. Eleanor spent each day at the train station, searching for James' face among the sea of returning soldiers, but she always returned empty-handed and with an increasingly heavy heart. Official reports still listed James as missing in action, a status that provided both hope and despair. Spring came, bringing new life to Boston. Flowers began to bloom and birds returned to sing, but the Wright family home was still shrouded in sadness. Ernest Wright finally succumbed to his illness on a bright morning in April, leaving Eleanor all alone. As the simple funeral took place, Eleanor felt a loneliness she had never experienced before. Now she was truly alone, without the father who had raised her with so much love, without James who had always protected her. However, in the midst of that darkness, Eleanor decided to remain strong and continue her life, as her father had always taught her. Eleanor's life changed once again when the library where she worked received a large donation of books from a retired university professor. Among the stack of books, Eleanor found an old journal about classical music. Its yellowing pages reminded her of her childhood when her mother was still alive and taught her to play the piano. Inspired by that memory, Eleanor began visiting the local music store after her work hours, asking permission to use the piano displayed there. The store owner, an old man named Mr. Harrison, was impressed with Eleanor's natural talent and offered her a job as a piano teacher for children in their neighborhood. Music became an escape and comfort for Eleanor. Her fingers, stiff from sewing work, slowly became soft and nimble again on the piano keys. She taught children with patience and affection, finding happiness in the laughter and progress of her students. Through music, Eleanor found a new purpose in her life, to share beauty and happiness in a world still recovering from the wounds of war. Years passed, and Eleanor slowly built a new life for herself. She rented a small apartment above the music store and spent her days teaching piano and working at the library. Her once brown hair began to show streaks of gray, but her eyes still radiated strength and determination. She formed a small music group that performed in hospitals and orphanages, bringing joy to those who needed it. The old Wright family home had to be sold to pay her father's medical debts, but Eleanor kept a few precious items as reminders of the past: a family photo in a silver frame, her father's war medal, and a music box James had given her on her 16th birthday. One evening in the summer of 1925, as Eleanor was playing the piano in a small restaurant, a stranger entered the room. The man was tall with slightly long blonde hair and deep blue eyes. He stopped and listened to Eleanor's performance with full attention, and when the song ended, he was the first to applaud. Eleanor smiled politely and continued to the next song, but throughout the evening, she felt the man's gaze following her. When the performance ended, the man approached her and introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Bennett, a doctor who had just returned from France after years of working with the Red Cross. Thomas invited Eleanor for coffee And although initially hesitant, Eleanor accepted his invitation. In that warm little cafe, Thomas told of his experiences treating wounded soldiers on the battlefield and how music was often the best medicine for wounded souls. Eleanor was captivated by the man's sincerity and kindness. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her heart, a feeling she had almost forgotten. That meeting was the beginning of a deep friendship between Eleanor and Thomas. They often spent time together, sharing stories and dreams. Thomas took Eleanor to classical music concerts and art exhibitions, opening a new world that had been inaccessible to her due to economic limitations. Meanwhile, Eleanor taught Thomas to play the piano, laughing at seeing the doctor's long fingers stumbling over the keys. The friendship slowly evolved into deep love, but Eleanor maintained a protective wall around her heart, afraid to lose someone she loved again. One night, as they walked home after watching an opera performance, Thomas held Eleanor's hand and proposed to her. Under the full moonlight, he promised to always be by her side, protecting and loving her for life. Tears fell on Eleanor's cheeks as she answered, "Yes," with a trembling voice. That night, before sleeping, Eleanor looked at James's photo that she always kept beside her bed, whispering hopefully that her brother, wherever he was, would be happy for her. Eleanor and Thomas's wedding was a simple affair at a small church on the outskirts of Boston, attended by their close friends. Eleanor wore a simple white dress with lace she had sewn herself and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the meadow near her old home. As she recited her wedding vows, Eleanor's heart was filled with happiness and sadness. Happy for finding new love, sad because none of her family could be present to witness this precious moment. Married life brought major changes for Eleanor. Thomas bought a Victorian-style house on the outskirts of town with a special music room where Eleanor could teach and practice. Eleanor continued working at the library and teaching piano, while Thomas opened his private medical practice that quickly became popular among local residents. After years of living with limitations, Eleanor could finally enjoy comfort and financial security. However, amid that happiness, James's shadow still often visited her dreams. In the autumn of 1927, Eleanor found herself pregnant. The news brought immense joy to the young couple. Thomas became very protective, ensuring Eleanor received the best nutrition and adequate rest. Eleanor herself began knitting tiny clothes and imagining what it would be like to be a mother. On quiet nights, she often spoke to the baby in her womb, telling stories about her family, about the brave grandfather, and about Uncle James, the gallant soldier who might one day return. In the spring of 1928, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy son. They named him James Ernest Bennett, honoring Eleanor's brother and father. Baby James had Thomas's blue eyes and Eleanor's brown hair, a perfect combination of both parents. Eleanor found new happiness in her role as a mother, enjoying every moment, from the first cry to the first smile, from the first step to the first word. Thomas also became an attentive father, often bringing home wooden toys he made himself and spending his precious hours playing with his son. Years passed peacefully for the Bennett family. Little James grew into a bright and energetic child, similar to his missing uncle. He showed musical talent like his mother, and by age 5 could already play simple songs on the piano, Eleanor continued teaching and now had a small music school in her home, while Thomas became increasingly respected as a doctor in their community. Though their lives were full and happy, Eleanor never stopped wondering about her brother's fate, and every year on James's birthday, she would light a candle in the window, hoping its light would guide home a lost soul. In 1935, while America was still struggling to emerge from the Great Depression, Eleanor received a letter from the War Department. Her heart pounded as she opened the brown envelope. Its contents were an official notification that remains identified as belonging to James Wright had been found in a small village in northern France, along with several other American soldiers. The letter also contained a posthumous Medal of Honor and condolences from the government. Eleanor sat on the steps of her house porch, tears flowing heavily as she finally received the certainty she had been waiting for. There was deep sadness, but also a strange relief from finally knowing her brother's fate. James's funeral was held with full honors at the Boston Military Cemetery. Eleanor, surrounded by Thomas and little James, now 7 years old, received the neatly folded American flag from a military officer. As the trumpet played taps, Eleanor felt as if a part of herself had finally found peace. She introduced little James to his uncle's grave, telling him how the man whose name he carried was a brave and kind-hearted hero. Little James placed a wildflower on the grave, the same flower that Eleanor always picked for her brother every spring. After the funeral, Thomas surprised Eleanor with a package sent from France. The package contained some personal belongings of James that had been found near where he was discovered: a broken pocket watch, some barely readable letters, and a small notebook. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the notebook and found her brother's handwriting, diary entries from the battlefield. The last page was dated a few days before James was reported missing, containing a short poem addressed to Eleanor. The poem spoke of hopes to return, of dreams for the future, and of a brother's love that would never fade. Inspired by James's poem, Eleanor began writing music, a requiem for her brother. She spent long nights in her music room, pressing piano keys and scribbling notes on music paper. Thomas fully supported this project, often bringing hot tea and blankets, when Eleanor lost track of time due to being too focused on her composition. After months of work, Requiem for James was finally completed, a piece that captured the sadness, courage, and hope that colored James Wright's life. Thanks to Thomas's connections with several musicians in the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Requiem for James got the opportunity to be played in a charity concert for war veterans. That night, Eleanor sat in the front row with Thomas and little James on either side of her, listening to the music born from her heart being played by a full orchestra. As the last notes drifted away, the entire auditorium stood and gave thunderous applause. Happy tears flowed down Eleanor's cheeks as she was given flowers and invited onto the stage. At that moment, Eleanor felt James's presence around her, proud and happy to see his sister. Requiem for James received widespread attention and began to be played in various cities across America. Eleanor received many letters from veterans and their families, thanking her for creating such a moving piece that expressed feelings often difficult to articulate with words. Royalties from the composition began to flow, giving Eleanor the financial freedom to establish a music foundation, providing scholarships for underprivileged children to learn music. She named it the James Wright Music Foundation. The following years were filled with happiness and achievement for Eleanor. Little James grew into a talented pianist and was eventually accepted into the Juilliard School of Music. Thomas remained the pillar of strength and love in her life, supporting her every step. Eleanor herself became a renowned composer and respected music teacher, often invited to give workshops and lectures at various universities. At the age of 50, she finally wrote a memoir titled Notes of Hope, telling her life journey from sadness to hope and how music had saved her. In the autumn of 1960, at the age of 64, Eleanor Wright Bennett was invited back to the small village in France, where her brother had died more than 4 decades earlier. The village had been rebuilt after the destruction of World War II, but its residents still remembered the sacrifice of American soldiers who fell on their soil. Eleanor, accompanied by Thomas, whose hair was now completely white, visited the place where James's remains had been found. There, the villagers had erected a simple monument to honor the soldiers, and James Wright's name was proudly engraved among the others. As Eleanor placed flowers at the foot of the monument, an elderly woman approached her. The woman introduced herself as Marie Dubois, the daughter of the farming family who had hidden and cared for the wounded James before he finally died. Marie recounted that James had stayed with her family for several weeks, and although they couldn't communicate due to the language barrier, James always mentioned the name Eleanor in his sleep. James had given Marie a photo, a picture of a young girl with wavy brown hair and emerald green eyes, a photo he always kept. Marie then gave the worn photo to Eleanor, returning a part of James that had been missing all these years. Back in Boston, Eleanor entered a new phase in her life. She and Thomas decided to retire and moved to a small house on the shore of Cape Cod. There, they enjoyed quiet days, walking along the beach every morning and watching the sunset every evening. Young James, now a famous concert pianist, often visited them with his wife and 2 children. Eleanor never stopped playing piano and writing music, and even in her old age, her fingers remained nimble on the black and white keys. In the winter of 1968, Thomas died peacefully in his sleep after suffering a mild heart attack. Eleanor, once again left by someone she loved, found strength in music and the affection of her family. James and his family moved closer to Eleanor's house, ensuring she wasn't lonely in her old age. Eleanor spent her free time teaching piano to her grandchildren and writing her second book, Symphony of Life, which told the story of her love journey with Thomas. At the age of 80, Eleanor was still active in the music community. The foundation she established had helped hundreds of talented young people pursue their dreams in music. Every year, on the anniversary of James's death, Eleanor held a charity concert where Requiem for James was always part of the program. Now, her grandchildren played it with new nuances and interpretations, but with the same emotion within. In the spring of 1979, Eleanor Wright Bennett died peacefully at her home in Cape Cod, surrounded by the family who loved her. As per her request, she was buried next to Thomas and close to the empty grave dedicated to James. On her tombstone was engraved a simple phrase, "Her life was a beautiful melody that will continue to echo in the hearts of those who loved her." James, now an internationally renowned musician, played his mother's last composition at the funeral service, a song full of hope and peace, reminiscent of birdsong in the morning. Eleanor Wright Bennett's legacy lives on in her works that continue to be played around the world, in the music foundation that continues to grow, and in her students who have now become music teachers for the next generation. But perhaps her greatest legacy is the example of the life she lived, a life that showed that from the deepest sadness, beauty can be born if one has the courage to keep loving and hoping. Seasons change, years pass, and the story of Eleanor Wright Bennett slowly became a legend among the Boston music community. The James Wright Music Foundation stands strong, now managed by Eleanor's great-grandchildren. In the main room of the foundation hangs a portrait of young Eleanor with her first piano, beside a photo of James in his military uniform and Thomas with his stethoscope around his neck, three people who formed the melody of Eleanor's life. Below these photos lies James's worn notebook, open to the last page, displaying the poem that inspired Requiem for James, eternal proof of voices that never fade. In the small garden beside the foundation building, a bronze statue depicts a hand playing the piano, inspired by Eleanor's hand. Every spring, flowers bloom around that statue, bringing life and color, just as Eleanor's music has brought light into many people's lives. And if someone stands long enough near that statue on a quiet evening, they might faintly hear the melody of Requiem for James, a melody born from sadness but containing limitless hope, like Eleanor Wright Bennett's life itself. Don't miss more beautiful historical narratives that resonate through time. Subscribe to Historias de Sombra now.